समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Let me begin with a confession. As you can see, I'm just past the age when it's fun to play with toy soldiers and model tanks, but I find military spectacles vaguely disquieting. And so I didn't sit through the endless Second World War parade which was held in Beijing after a 10-year hiatus. The parade comes on the back of a string of high-octane movies on China's role in the Second World War, which have been released over the last couple of years. The 800 and The Flowers of War are good examples. Like so many movies in this genre, including their Indian counterparts, they basically fetishize martyrdom. Now, there's no problem at all with China choosing to have its own Victory Day. The country did help to win the Second World War, in the process losing millions of lives to bombs, famine, flooding, and the pure sadism of Japanese chemical warfare experiments, which were carried out by units like the notorious Unit 731. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that today. Actually, the problem is a little more subtle and has to do with how history is told and who gets to do the telling. The bulk of the fighting against Japan from 1931 to 1945 was carried out by the Kuomintang, the Chinese nationalists who eventually lost to the communists. In 1938, efforts to build a joint front against the Japanese collapsed, and the communists retreated into the Yunnan heartland, leaving a lot of the fighting to the nationalists. Things were complicated by the fact that the Soviet Union didn't really want the communists fighting the Japanese, since Moscow did not want to open a second front while it was fighting Nazi Germany. Remember, the Soviet Union and Japan were not enemies till almost the very end of the war. So, who won and who lost, and how far does the truth-telling really go? Hi, and welcome to this issue of the Print Explorer, and a special thanks to those of you who've seen a previous episode and come back for more. Viewers like you come to the Print because of the exceptional quality of our from-the-ground reporting and our deeply researched analysis. All of this costs money though, and that's why we need the support of each of you. Please consider taking a subscription, spare a moment. You'll find the links in the pane below. From late in the 19th century, Japan had begun to turn its eyes to the massive reserves of hydrocarbons and minerals in continental Asia, the very riches that had drawn imperial powers from across the world to our continent. Taiwan was taken in 1895, followed by the Liaodong Peninsula in 1905 and Korea in 1910. For those who fondly imagine that Asian colonialism was any better than European colonialism, well, no. Korea was subjected to ethnocide by its new Japanese rulers. The country's language was crushed and its history erased. Koreans were forced to worship new gods and even compelled to abandon their traditional names. Lands were handed over to Japanese settlers who remade the country's agricultural foundations, and hundreds of thousands of workers were shipped overseas to labor for their new imperial masters. The build-up to the Second World War, journalist Erin Blakemore writes, even saw hundreds of thousands of Korean women forced into sex work for the Imperial Japanese Army. From 1928, the nationalist movement of Chiang Kai-shek had been attempting to build a unified nation in China, but his progress had been very uneven. The nationalist government, made advances in certain areas like transport infrastructure and restoring the basics of a tax system, but it at once failed to address rural hunger. The nationalists hoped that, given enough time, they would be able to build an economy centered around a small group of large corporations controlled by a one-party state that would dominate the public sphere. Exactly the kind of model we saw in large parts of East Asia after the war. Events came to a head in 1931 though, when a Japanese military unit in Manchuria called the Kwantung Army staged a coup and seized all of northeastern China. The region had been ceded to Japan by the Beijing Emperor in 1920. Though the Kwantung Army was subordinate to imperial headquarters, its officers made independent decisions and were very rarely punished for taking them. Late in 1939, though, the Kwantung Army suffered a humbling defeat at the hands of the Soviet Union and abandoned its plans to expand further into Siberia. The general who taught them a humbling lesson would be the same one who humiliated the Nazis at the famous Battle of Stalingrad, but that's another story. The interesting thing here, which I'm sure you've noticed, is that a kind of parallel Second World War had broken out in Asia. Like Nazi Germany was laying territorial claims to Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland, Imperial Germany had its own ideas about what countries it wanted to take over. Even as the skirmishes continued in the vast emptiness of Manchuria, the war also began to expand home. In 1937, a small skirmish broke out between Chinese troops and locally garrisoned Japanese soldiers outside Beijing. Already facing the Japanese territorial demands in northern China, Chiang Kai-shek decided that the moment to resist had arrived. Chinese troops pushed back, and within days, Chiang had ordered a second front to also begin operations around Shanghai. This first phase of the war was marked by fierce combat in northern and central China. As nationalist troops pushed back from Beijing, Shanghai and Nanjing, they found themselves unable to confront the Japanese army. They did put up a fight though, and they were joined by communist forces who formed a united front. Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, set up his new headquarters in Chongqing, which suffered constant air bombardment from 1938 to 1943. Pretty much like London, which gets talked about a lot more. Fighting hard, the armies had arrived at a kind of stalemate by 1938. The puppet government of Wang Jing controlled the cities of Nanjing and Shanghai with the support of the Japanese Imperial Army. The nationalists controlled southwest China and parts of central China, and the communists ruled the Shaanxi, Gansu, Ningxia region with their capital at Yan'an. The United Front idea of resistance to the Japanese collapsed as each of the three groups tried to consolidate its power in its own territories. The Red Army, led by He Long, attacked and wiped out a brigade of Chinese militia led by Zhang Yinwu in Hebei in June 1939. Starting in 1940, open conflict between nationalists and communists became more frequent in the occupied areas outside Japanese control, culminating in the infamous Anhui clashes in January 1941, which left thousands injured. Everywhere in Asia, truth be told, was cracking. As the war sucked in more global power, people found themselves in odd positions. In India, of course, we know some Indians fought on the side of the British, others against them, while still others refused to cooperate in the war effort. In Pakistan's northwest, some soldiers fought against their kith and kin who were fighting against the British. In Burma next door, some tribes were pro-British and others were pro-Japanese. Each of these communities had to make terrible moral choices. And if you attend events for soldiers who fought in those times, sometimes you can still hear plenty of bitterness because one set of choices often had awful consequences for for comrades who till the day before had been fighting with you. Following the Imperial Japanese airstrike on Pearl Harbor in 1941, American strategists awoke to the intelligence officials and civilian missionaries who had long been pleading with them to support nationalist China against Tokyo. The relationship was not an easy one though. General George Stilwell, who was assigned as General Chiang's chief of staff, saw the nationalist leader as personally and politically corrupt, lacking the moral fiber and stomach for war. General Chiang, in turn, was frustrated by America's inability to understand the crushing human and financial costs of the 5-year-long war they had already been waging. In November 1943, Chiang took part in the Allied conference at Cairo, during which the fate of post-war Asia was discussed. The next spring, the Japanese launched Operation Ishigo, their last major thrust into central China. This ended up destroying large parts of the already enfeebled nationalist military capacity. Now, despite the destruction of his heartland, General Chiang authorized his troops to take part in the campaign in Burma in 1944, in which American, British Empire and Chinese troops operated together against the Japanese and their Indian National Army allies, that is, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose's forces. And why did Chiang do that? Because he needed the support of the Allied powers in a post-war settlement. American military officials, meanwhile, were wondering if the option to Chiang might not be better. They made their first visit to the communist-controlled areas where they met Mao Zedong and other top communist leaders. This deepened tensions between Chiang and his American advisors, and Stilwell was recalled from China. Yet, President Franklin D. Roosevelt still kept his promises to the nationalists by engineering the elevation of China to the highest levels of global diplomacy in the post-war world and arguing for China to take its place as one of the prominent members of the Security Council of the new United Nations organization. Then, in August 1945, land war still raging across Asia, the United Nations dropped nuclear weapons on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Japanese got the message. They understood that the destructive capabilities of these new kinds of weapons made it completely pointless to fight on. Little doubt exists the Japanese were psychopathic rulers even by the standards of the Second World War. For years, prisoners brought to Unit 731 at Zongma Fort and other locations suffered torture which is unimaginable. For some days, selected prisoners would be on a diet of rice or wheat, meat, fish, and occasionally even alcohol in order to be in excellent health at the beginning of experiments. Then, over several days, prisoners were drained of blood and deprived of nutrients and water. Their deteriorating health was casually recorded. In other cases, prisoners were vivisected, others were deliberately infected with plague, bacteria, and other microbes. Plague-infested fleas bred in the laboratories of Unit 731 and Unit 1644 were spread by low-flying airplanes over Chinese cities, including coastal Ningbo and Changde, Hunan province, in 1940 and 1941. These operations killed tens of thousands of people. There was another expedition in Nanjing that involved spreading typhoid and paratyphoid germs into the wells, marshes, and houses. So when we read angry Chinese commentary about Japan and its failure to offer a fulsome apology for its role in the Second World War, that is, at least to my mind, understandable. Among the most brutal violence came at Nanjing, where an estimated 200,000 people were killed in cold blood and over 30,000 women were raped when Japanese forces overran the city on 13 December 1937. Newer historical research has shown that the Nanjing massacre was far from an outlier, with a string of similar mass killings taking place as Japanese forces advanced along the lower Yangtze River. Nakagawa Yonezo, professor emeritus at Osaka University, studied at Kyoto University during the war. While he was there, he recalls, he watched footage of human experiments and executions from Unit 731. He later testified about the playfulness of the experimenters. There is such a thing as professional curiosity, he recalled. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around. Professional people like to play. It's a chilling thought. The Chinese victims of the war, unlike many killed in Europe like Jews or members of Romani communities, never really got justice. 12 Unit 731 members were tried by the Soviet Union in the 1941 Khabarovsk war crimes trials and sentenced. However, many key figures, including Unit 731 boss Shiro Ishii, were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for sharing their research data with the Americans. The Harry S. Truman administration, we now know, concealed the unit's crimes and even paid stipends to former personnel to help them resettle in America. Generations on, though, there's no doubt setting right historical consciousness isn't high on the Chinese Communist Party's mind either. There's been no serious acknowledgement in China that the men who founded the government in Taiwan were also those who bled and died fighting the Japanese, and thus allowed Mao Zedong to come to power. There's been no acknowledgement either of China's more modern savageries, from its slaughter of unarmed students at Tiananmen Square or the ethnocide conducted in Xinjiang. Yet, it is unacceptable that Japan has not seen fit to issue a formal apology to China and other nation states that it brutalized in the course of the Second World War. The museum at the Yasukuni Jinja shrine in Tokyo, where the ashes of the war dead, including some war criminals, are respectfully kept, makes no mention of the obscene acts of violence committed by Japanese soldiers. There has been no effort, unlike in Germany, to teach Japanese school children about the truth of what their grandparents and great-grandparents did. The bitterness we've just seen over the war commemoration shows how much resentment still clouds Asia's vision of the Second World War. Unless we find a language to start telling the truth about what happened, it will always be easy for opportunistic politicians to manipulate half-truths and whole lies, perpetuating the hatred. Asians, all of us, need to swallow our shame and engage in truth-telling, lest we again end up walking down the path to perdition. I'm Praveen Swami and I'm a contributing editor to ThePrint. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer.